you so much, Vinny. It is a delight to be here, and we are so grateful for the opportunity to participate in the conversation around the world. A note of appreciation for CSR in Ukraine and the aspiration that we all share in the CSR movement to connect, asking bigger questions about what is the aspirations for a good life and a good society and the role that business can play in making that possible. And so for everyone on the Ukraine CSR team, for everyone working in the field, thank you. And also a shout out of gratitude to GlobeScan, Chris Coulter and the team for the vision and the commitment to making this conversation happen all around the world. I am delighted to join in today with my great friend, Sasha Ronko, and in a moment, we will also have a chance to meet Sanjay Khanna. And what we're hoping to do today is talk a little bit about how might we navigate the world that we are currently in toward the world that we hope might be. And what are the roles of brands in this opportunity to create a regenerative future? And how might we as individuals play our part? There'll be three parts of the conversation. We'll do a quick hello so that Sasha has a chance to share a little bit about her background, but then we'll have three chapters. Chapter one, BBMG and GlobeScan last week put out a new report, as Vinny just shared, that is called Leading Regenerative Brands. And so I'm going to spend about maybe 15 minutes giving highlights of what we learned in that body of research and practice. And it's really 5 paradigm shifts that we might all explore together to think about moving from the world we're in to the world that we want. And then we're really delighted to have an intergenerational conversation. Myself, Raphael Bemperad from BBMG, Sanjay Khanna, who is a futurist and a futurist in residence at BBMG, and Sasha Ronko, who is one of the leaders of Extinction Rebellion Youth in Los Angeles. And so we'll open it up to a conversation across different generations to think about the themes that we're all exploring together. So that's what we'll be sharing today. And first of all, I'll pass it over to you, if that's okay, Sasha. I'd love to know, first of all, welcome, great to see you. Where does this conversation find you today? And what about the idea of creating a regenerative future is most resonant for you? When you thought about the theme for today, what attracted you? What gave you energy about that invitation? So I'll pass it over to you and welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm currently in downtown Los Angeles, and the thing that drew me to this conversation is really the fact that it's international and it's cross-border. I think that a lot of the climate movement tends to center itself in places like Europe and the United States that have sort of histories of political systems that we can work within that are really concrete and convoluted in a way that sort of perpetuates a certain type of climate action. And so we sort of have a youth activism movement that sort of reflects that, but our youth activism, specifically our youth climate activism, needs to stretch beyond those borders. And so that's kind of something that really intrigued me about entering this conversation.
Wonderful. And to what degree have you already connected with your own peers in the XR movement from around the world?
So we've connected, I personally haven't connected with Europe, but I know that a lot of my peers in XR that have been involved in XR Youth National longer, we are in contact with XR Global a lot, which oversees sort of all of the different chapters across the world, and XR in the UK, which is where it all comes from. So we stem from a UK movement that's really successful over there. Our youth chapters and our adult chapters, they all stem from the UK. So we are all products of that. Yeah, but I know that some of our actions, especially in Los Angeles, when we were targeting sort of the situation with Line 3, which was a pipeline that ran from Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin, that was also a conversation with people in Canada and Indigenous peoples in Canada and governments in Canada and corporations in Canada. So we sort of cross that border more locally.
Beautiful. Well, welcome, Sasha. We're really thrilled you're joining us today.
Yeah.
So just to begin, I'll set some context for our conversation by sharing some of the things that we have learned working together with GlobeScan about the moment we're in and the future that we might build together. And then we'll dive into a conversation. Sasha and Sanjay will join us shortly after. So just to frame up this body of work, so BBMG, our team at BBMG, which is based in the United States, is a brand consultancy that has been focused explicitly on sustainability and social impact since we were founded in 2003. And over now almost 12 years, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with GlobeScan to reveal insights from consumer research, but also by speaking broadly with a diverse set of practitioners and experts and leaders to understand sort of what are the ways through the moments that we're in and how might we build brands that can regenerate our world. In this particular case, last week, we shared this report, Leading Regenerative Brands, rooted in conversations with elders, with young activists and leaders like Sasha, with brand practitioners, and with over 30,000 consumers around the world. And with GlobeScan, we really focused on what might we learn by looking at generational differences between those who are under 30 and those who are over 30 about themes and priorities and issues that matter most right now. And so what I'd love to share is a very brief version of what we heard in our conversation and 5 paradigm shifts that can help us navigate this particular moment. The first thing I'd love to share is the idea of living in a liminal time. One of our favorite philosophers and authors is a gentleman named Charles Eisenstein. And Charles has said that we're living in the space between stories, that we're recognizing that the stories that we've been inheriting, whether that's profit maximization in a capitalist society, or the people who have the most things are the most successful, or that we can produce without mindfulness of people and planetary health. We've inherited all these stories that are simply no longer serving us, that we know that we have to begin and really rapidly let go of. But the new story of our common humanity and how we might create the world where we all can flourish together is just emerging. It's a very gentle, delicate story that's yet to be. And we're living literally in the space in between. And a lot of the discomfort and the complexity and the chaos and the stress and the overwhelm comes from the fact that we're living in the space in between. And the idea of living in a liminal space or liminal life appreciates the fact that we're simply in an initial phase of a transition or a process, and that we're occupying a position that is on both sides of a boundary or a threshold. And I share that both because to share a moment of empathy with the stress that we all feel all around the world, and particularly in the Ukraine right now, but also a note of wonder and awe and hope and possibility, which is that there's a space yet to be created. We're in a space where we can be creative. And so how do we navigate this liminal space? How do we navigate liminal life? And from a brand perspective, and at BBMG, we think about brand as the combination. It's not just like your identity or your logo or your value proposition. It's fine that it's a message, image, and experience. But what we really think about in terms of brand is that it is the culmination, the manifestation of the systems that we design and the stories that we tell. And so as a brand, we have the opportunity, as we think about business models, supply chain, how we think about those who make, produce, sell our goods or services, and what happens where they come from and where they go after and through the use of life. So branding actually is the manifestation of the systems that we can design together. But brands also are this unique element in civilization which hold our stories, our culture, our sense of identity, our sense of aspiration, our sense of belonging, community, and connection. And so what's thrilling about thinking about brand as a vehicle for transformation and for social change and impact is that it gives us the opportunity to redesign the systems and retell the stories. that can be in service of humanity flourishing together with planet Earth. And so when you think about navigating this liminal space in between stories, it's a new era for brand, not only because we're challenged with greater and greater urgency to try to solve for new systems design and stories that we can hold together, but also because it's inviting us to navigate very profound shifts in fundamental paradigms about how we see ourselves in the world, how we design businesses and society and in the market. And so this new era for branding simply seems to say, or seeks to say, that we're no longer in the business of trying to just navigate consumer preference and think that it's solving something if we just iteratively make incremental improvements. We're actually in a time of reconceptualization of the whole paradigm in which we're working. And so today I'd like to very quickly share 5 paradigm shifts that will help us understand the world that we're in and help us guide brands, guide organizations to the future that we might all want to be part of. The first paradigm shift is a shift in power. And ultimately, if we think about the stories that we're inheriting and the story of power, what we've seen in our globalized industrial economy is the concentration of power at the top, whether that's global concentrated headquarters of businesses or supply chains or marketing teams that are concentrated in one place and making decisions for folks that are far removed from where they are. And ultimately, this concentration of power, as we've seen over the last number of years, is profoundly unfit to meet the needs of people and community, and people really at the very forefront of impacts of climate and of social justice. And so our invitation is to think about power in a new way, which is how might we give more voice, more choice, and more ownership with those who have the most at stake in the decisions that we're making? How might we bring new perspectives, divergent voices to the table and create and set a bigger table that's more participatory, more distributed, and more democratized for all to participate in? And so it's a paradigm shift from a previous story of power over to a new story of power with. A dear friend of ours named Pablo Benavides, who's a sustainability leader in Buenos Aires, talked about what it means to cultivate new power and what it means to welcome power from the ground up and from community backwards to decisions. And what he shared is new power works like a current. It's held by many, discharged and distributed. It's proactive, participatory, and peer-driven. So like electricity, it's more forceful when these conditions increase. And so our goal should be to channel it. And some examples of how the shift toward power with comes to life. If you look at Koa Chocolate, they're using distributed models and blockchain to actually protect the integrity and dignity of every worker, to guarantee workers' rights and human rights, and to make sure that no one can steal anyone's wages and that it's all transparent. We work with Macy's on something called Mission Everyone, all rooted in bold representation that commits $5 billion to diversify their partners, their designers, their vendors, their supply chains, so that everyone has more voice, choice, and ownership at the table. And so the first opportunity to think about leading regenerative brands is actually shifting power. And what that invites us to think about is design for regeneration by welcoming diverse perspectives, a wider representation, and deeper connections with the people you serve and those who have a stake in the outcome of the decisions being made, and bringing them closer to the decision when it's being made itself. The second is a paradigm shift around space. And what has happened over the last 70 years or so is that manufacturing is happening somewhere else. And we see supply chains are rooted somewhere else. Those who are making the products that we use are located somewhere else. And as the space between the nodes in a value chain and relationship network inside of the brands and services that we create gets wider and wider, inside of that increased space lies the opportunity for exploitation of people and the planet. And so the question is, how might we close the distance between the people and places that make and use and sell our products and services? This is about letting go of a story that things happen or are made for, and don't affect us because it's somewhere over there. And in fact, it's about cultivating deeper connection and integrity right in our own backyards, and ideally producing more exactly where we are. Yulu Weck is a leader of the International Indigenous Youth Council in Los Angeles, a peer of Sasha locally. And Yulu has talked quite a lot about what it means to cultivate placefulness and consent to both the people and the land where products are made. So if we truly want to have a livable planet, Yulu shares, we can't move from an extractive lens. We must move with the knowledge of and consent from the land and indigenous peoples who have a longstanding symbiotic and sustainable relationship with our planet. And so if we think about what Yulu is sharing, some examples of what it means to get more proximate with the people and places where our products can be made and where they come from. There's a lot of folks. We work with Ocean X, which is a media company and a conservation organization with oceanographers and ocean explorers. It's all about creating intimacy in people's experience with the deep ocean, because the idea is that when we have an experience of something in a relationship with something, we will care for it. And when we fall in love with something, we'll want to protect it and make it our own. And so the invitation for a shift in space from over there to right here is, what does it look like to cultivate more proximity with more intimacy and empathy for every person, every place, at every step? The third paradigm shift is a shift in time. And I think what we have certainly all experienced is just the incredible pace increasing over time and instantaneous everything. But as whether it's, getting something delivered within 10 minutes with DoorDash or Grubhub or I guess Amazon Prime, that race to speed is profoundly affecting our health. It's burning our relationships with the people who are making and sharing and delivering these resources. And it invites us to reflect and ask, what is this for? Because we're burning out, we're stressing out, we're overwhelmed in a race to speed that's not serving anyone. And it's leaving very negative shadows and consequences in its wake. So what does it look like to slow down, move with intention, and as the author Layla Saad says, become good ancestors? And this is ultimately moving from instantaneous to intentional with our time. Hala Thomasdottir, who's the CEO and chief catalyst of the B Team, and is championing CSR and ESG initiatives all around the world with the biggest companies in the world, shared with me at the end of last year that she's starting to recognize the relationship between personal sustainability and health and planetary sustainability and health. And that when we're constantly moving to be faster, more instantaneous, and burning out, we're ultimately not serving anyone. And so a great example of like broadening the spectrum of time, two ways of looking at this. One, New Belgium Brewery, the incredible beer company in Colorado, wanted to highlight from a time perspective what it would look like in 10, 15 years if the impacts of climate change can't be reversed, when we no longer have the ingredients of wheat or barley or grain or hops that go in their beer. And when you take those ingredients out, it tastes terrible. And they actually produced a beer that tastes miserable because it was missing the ingredients that climate change is taking away from us. And it was elevating, it's called Torched Earth beer. And it was all about thinking about how do we think about ourselves in the space of time. Mindsets is a campaign from Nike that's showing what it looks like to connect physical health and mental health and elevate the opportunity that movement provides in our personal well-being. So this third shift around time is slowing down, moving with intention, and thinking in terms of generational impact, not just quarterly gains. The fourth paradigm shift is around leadership. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to all of us that the incentives, the norms of behavior, the strategies, the tools, the models that got us here are no longer sufficient for where we need to go. And what leadership allows us to think about in this liminal space is the reality that not knowing the answer is no longer a liability. It actually is our greatest gift because it opens the opportunity to explore what's possible. And so leadership is ultimately about welcoming vulnerability, embracing not knowing, and turning challenges that we don't know the answers to into quests. And so this is really about leadership. Used to be a fantasy of having all the answers, and now it's an invitation to welcome braver questions. And I love the conversation that we had with Frederick Laloux, who's the author of an incredible book called Reinventing Organizations. And he shared with us, as leaders, we're often celebrated as problem solvers, and that for many of us, it is uncomfortable, almost unbearably so, to be confronted with questions that force us to admit we don't have answers. The dissonance often compels us to ignore the hard questions and focus solely on the ones we know how to solve. But then we have it upside down. The true sign of leadership is the ability to sit with a hard question with no immediate answer, long enough until answers begin to emerge, as they almost always do. And an example of leadership in this new, vulnerable and humble place is also about welcoming perspectives to the table that are different from your own and bringing experiences in that you haven't lived yourself. So the Body Shop, Be Seen, Be Heard is all about getting young people like Sasha to run for office. Ben & Jerry's has social justice activists on their independent board of directors. So when you're opening a space of not knowing, it sparks and invites your curiosity, and curiosity creates connection to people with different ideas. And that's the path to better insights and better opportunities. So this is a moment to reframe leadership as welcoming vulnerability, turning challenges into questions and living the questions with diverse viewpoints and intergenerational perspectives. The final example or paradigm shift is around relationship. And I think if there's anything that we're understanding now, is that it is a fantasy that we're not dependent and interdependent with one another and on one another. We're noticing right now all around the world that a wildfire or a tornado or a climate event here is affecting a food supply access issue over in another part of the world. War in Ukraine is creating ripple effects for migrants and for food supply and for energy supply all around the world. What we understand is that we are intimately interconnected. And perhaps of all of these paradigm shifts, the single idea that's at the core is the fallacy of separation, the idea that somehow we're separated from each other or the world or the earth. And so the invitation for the paradigm shift of relationship to conclude here is how might we widen the circle of connection to thrive together with all of life, from into this kind of idea of rugged individualism and independence to interdependence and connection. And Caroline Dwell, who is the founder of All Good Products, it's a kind of a personal care product company in Southern California. She shares to be a better world is a resilient connection between humans and our surroundings in a way that is mutually beneficial and mutually respectful. And the way she tries to live is by constantly seeking more self-awareness for how one's work and actions impact not only yourself, your family, but also the community and the greater world, and making sure that all of those relationships are righteous relationships and that it's all good. And a great example of this is Rhino Foods is a company in Vermont that makes the cookie dough that goes in Ben & Jerry's ice cream. They have the income advance program that allows any worker to borrow money from a pool that everyone shares if they need to pay a bill or fix the car or get extra help. They have a pool for all employees that they can all draw from, and then they just pay back without interest so that everyone has the opportunity to be supported and share resources. Obviously, IKEA speaks to this ecosystem of interdependence as they move toward a circular economy by 2030. So the invitation for relationship is how might we honor our interdependence of all of our relationships and design holistically to benefit the entire ecosystem. Ultimately, navigating this liminal space in between invites us to think about what it means to be a regenerative brand. And I'll conclude with these three qualities that I would invite our community to consider as we navigate the change. The first is being aware, and that brands can sense and serve the truest and deepest needs of people in society. The second brand quality is additive, which is giving more than we take by playing a positive generative role in an interconnected and living ecosystem. And then alive is creating energy and momentum and culture to shape who we are and how we live. And so this report is available for free. You can check it out at bbmg.com, leading-regenerative-brands. And it will share not only more voices and more examples of these 5 paradigm shifts and practices that we can explore and work to emulate from people all over different industries around the world, but it also has highlights from BBMG and GlobeScan survey data with 30,000 people around the world, including generational differences. And that's what will turn us to the next chapter of our conversation, which is to welcome Sasha Ronko as our guest today. And Sasha, it's a delight to be with you, and I'm so grateful for your time. And as we think about this space in between, this liminal space between stories from what we've inherited and the world that we seek, that's probably very close to your experience every day, because you're looking at the world around you that you're inheriting, and I'm sure you have questions. And you're also working with all of your peers at Extinction Rebellion Youth in Los Angeles to imagine what can be next. And so I'm curious, if you don't mind, thinking about the moment that we're in, how would you describe the world we're living in today in a couple adjectives?
I think that it's uniquely convoluted in a way that can seem kind of innavigable. You have a lot of different issues that have perpetuated for years and years and years. And you have a lot of different people trying to solve them in a lot of different ways. And it feels like when you're inheriting the world and when you're entering it, having not been able to see these things come together and to not inherently know the roots of them, it can seem innavigable and sort of too tangled to tackle. And that's really daunting. But I also think it's such an opportune time, because with that convolution, we can look at all of the systems that sort of house all of the issues that we're looking at, and we can, by taking that look at those systems and taking a look at all of these issues from another step back, this is a unique time in that we can do that. We have all of these issues sort of climaxing in some way, and there's events of eco-fascism, mass racist violence. We can see them actively, and it's a unique opportunity and a unique time to be able to do that, and also look at the systems that house those things and be able to sort of make this convolution a tackleable thing. We have a profound opportunity for sort of intersectionality. And instead of just looking at these issues as individual things, as climate, as separate from racism, as separate from homophobia, as separate from misogyny, we can't look at those things as separate things. We have to look at them as a systemic issue. And in this time, we have a unique opportunity to do that. And I think that's what's really sort of hopeful and wistful about the time that we're living in, especially with such a mobilization of the youth right now. I think that the youth have made this an opportune time. I don't think it would have been an opportune time if it were not for the sort of youth counterculture, the radicalism, the progression, the drive, and the ambition that we and my peers foster. I think that's a really valuable thing that the youth have been able to offer.
Sasha, you mentioned a moment that feels convoluted, impossible to navigate, rooted in intersecting dynamics of racism and ecological destruction, patriarchy, misogyny. With all of that in mind, and your peers working together with you, what would you say is a way of describing in a couple adjectives the future that you see as possible? How would you describe the future that you want?
I think that everybody wants an equitable future, but you have to go one step beyond that. You have to say that for so long, a sort of profiteering mindset has allowed like progress and progression and the ability to thrive and benefit from the places we live in and the systems we draw on. I think that's been confined, just historically, that's been confined to an elite class. And the future that we want and that all of us should want, because it's the future that will benefit all of us, no matter who you are, no matter if you are the richest person in the country or the poorest person in the country. The future that we will all benefit from is an equitable one, not where we can just all sort of exist safely, which is current goal and the current necessary goal, but we can take that, we can transfer that power from that elite class that gets to thrive and that gets to draw on the systems that govern us, and we can transfer that spirit and that power across everyone so that we can all draw on the systems that govern us, and we can all use the things that they offer us to our own benefit. I think because that's what they exist for. We wield our power, our democratic power, to these systems so that they can help us. And I feel like that sentiment has been lost, but historically that's what it is. That's what a democracy is. And we have to, that's the kind of future that I would like to see, where a return to that sort of, I don't think it's ever existed, so I won't say a return, but like a theoretical return to a sort of a system where if we do wield our power to government leaders, if we do wield our power to business leaders, if we do wield our power to leaders in general, their leadership will benefit us and not just this elite class that gets to take the progression and that gets to take the thriving and that gets to take more than just sort of an existence that is survivalist.
Sasha, can you share a story in your experience with XR Youth that has placed you in this, I hear from you, kind of committed but also hopeful place in between the convoluted, the challenging, the unnavigatable, but also this equitable, just, and broadly shared power. What was your journey into this work? What was the moment where you understood this would be part of your life? And can you just kind of walk us through your experience of that?
I don't know if there was just a single moment, but I think for a lot of people my age, 16, 15, 16, 17, I'm 17, I think going into the pandemic at such a pivotal time in your life sort of twists something in your brain. You can no longer look at the world as what you viewed it always, because you have a mass like media that's covering this story that's affecting so many people across the world, entirely across the world. You know, we'll see in media constantly stories that are affecting people locally or nationally or even, you know, a few nations away. That's the media that we're going to get. We'll get big stories from other places, but we get mostly the media that's local to us, and that's the media that we care about. But what the pandemic did was it really kind of thrust all of our brains into thinking about the world, especially, and I think for youth that's really important because we're constantly learning things. We're in school and we are learning things and applying things that we're learning to what we're seeing in the media, and I think that sort of twisted something in my brain. It said, I can't just focus on what's in my immediate surroundings and in my setting. I have to focus on things that are beyond me. And that was really anxiety provoking because it's taxing and it's scary and it feels like the weight of the future is on your shoulders when it's not. The weight of the future is on nobody's shoulders. It's something that we're all trying to push, like a ball that we're trying to roll, but none of us are quite touching it. And so you're just kind of hoping that this sort of sense of gravity rolls it eventually, because none of us are quite there. Nobody has enough power to kind of tip it. So I think that it was sort of just this perpetuative anxiety and helplessness that the pandemic kind of brought to me. Once you take a look at the world, you can't close your eyes. So that's what that did for, I think, a lot of people my age. And then when you have that anxiousness and that helplessness, you either ignore it, you take a nihilistic point of view and you say, oh, well, what are we going to do? Or you can say, I'm going to do everything in my power. I'm going to do everything I possibly can. And I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong about anything that you choose to do with that. It takes a lot of sort of mental strength that in a pandemic, a lot of people weren't able to offer. And I think that's also really important to recognize. But I think that a lot of youth, a lot of really empowered and ambitious youth were able to say, I need to do everything in my power to help the situations I'm seeing in the world, the situations I refuse to close my eyes to. And for me, that was a lot of climate stuff, because living in LA, I hear drought, I hear so much about climate change and climate movements, especially just with a lot of different political perspectives in my own family. It was an issue that's constantly contested among just familial peers. So that was kind of the issue I centered on. I also thought it was a really intersectional issue. So I was able to look at a lot of things differently, having learned more about the climate movement. So it was kind of a mixture of all of those things. It was that anxiety and helplessness, and that forcing me to look at the issues that exist in our world, because the pandemic put our world under a spotlight, and we all had to look at everything. And just selecting, it wasn't a selection of the climate movement as the issue I wanted to focus on. It was the fact that that was what was present with me, and it was what I'd grown up kind of talking about the most and hearing about the most. So it was a combination of all of those things.
Thank you, Sasha. And we'll come back to a moment in a second about how activism plays a role for you in creating change, specifically in some of the actions that you've been part of. I'd love to welcome our other colleague in this conversation, Sanjay Khanna. And Sanjay, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you don't mind, we'd love for you to begin just by sharing a little bit about who you are, the work that you do very briefly. And then the way we started with Sasha, which I'd ask you as well, is how would you describe the world we're living in today in one or two adjectives? So if you could just do a very brief hello and a little bit of context about the work that you do, and then describe the moment we're in a word or two.
Share her thoughts and your thoughtful reflections. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Or
yeah, it's a little digitized, and so it may be fine if you want to try to just turn off your camera for a second, and then we'll hear you maybe a little better.
Okay, sure, sounds good. How's that? Is that better?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thanks, Sanjay.
Okay, perfect. So I'm a futurist. I'm a foresight expert, and I ended up thinking about how changes in the world might play out, particularly these kinds of big disruptive changes like climate change. In my early to mid 20s, I started
Hey, Sasha, can you hear him? Because I don't hear him anymore. Do you hear him? Okay. So I'll write a note to hey, Sanjay. We weren't able to hear you. It cut out for about 30 seconds. So it may be worthwhile to maybe sign out and sign back in, and we'll come right back to you in a second. While we wait for Sanjay, hopefully to get a strong connection, I'm curious for you, Sasha, you were really talking about the profound impact of the pandemic on your experience and the experience of your peers, your appreciation for the interconnected dynamics of the issues we're facing, and the belief that everyone can show up in their way to affect change. Tell us a little bit about, like, what is the way that Extinction Rebellion organizes for change? What is the way that you work? How do you affect change in the world? What's the role of XR in creating change? How does it work? And could you give us some examples?
Yes, absolutely. So XR we are direct, nonviolent civil disobedience in terms of our actions. We are an apolitical, decentralized group of youth organizers we are all working together, and we have, the only reason we have people like me, I coordinate the communications segment of XRYLA. The only reason we have group coordinators and working group coordinators is just for efficiency purposes in terms of communicating with each other and making sure if something needs to be done urgently, we have somebody to do it. Beyond that, it's a really decentralized group, and we're all working together constantly to try and get things done. In terms of our actual change making, we do a lot of education stuff, specifically in LA. Since I've joined, we've done teach-ins, we've done flea markets where the profits have been donated as a form of mutual aid. And we've also done actions. The first action that I attended was a roadblock outside of the Los Angeles Federal Building. That was a protest calling for federal action in regards to line 3, which I talked a little about earlier, and I really suggest you research because it's a really relevant issue: pipelines, oil. And the second action was Climate Halloween, which was a coalition event, and then the third one, which was recently, just this past Friday, we had an action at the Americana brand, which is a shopping mall owned by LA mayoral candidate Rick Caruso. And we demanded that Rick Caruso has no climate action plan whatsoever. There isn't one on his website. He's in the past had representatives refuse to comment on his climate action plan because there simply isn't one. And he's been asked for weeks and weeks and weeks to deliver one, but hasn't, and didn't even before the mayoral primaries. We demanded that he create a climate action plan. That was the basis of that action, and it was at a property he owned. And there were some cool photos of us on Caruso Avenue. A lot of that action and a lot of what XR does is we aggravate in a way that we know will incite action. We are youth, and we can't directly influence corporations. We can't go into these meetings and we can't say, not yet, what we want to do, but we can't just yet because of the way things are organized. We can't go into meetings and we can't go into corporate environments and say, these are the things we want, points A, B, and C, because we don't have the experience in those places yet that is warranted and required generally to be in those environments. But we have, youth passion and ambition and drive, and we have the ability to say, this is what we want. You do everything in your power to get it for us because this is our future. That's kind of the basis of XRY. And that's our basis nationally. I'm also a member of the national group, and that's also what we want all of our local groups to that's the power we want all of our local groups to kind of inhabit, and the spirit we want all of us to bring and to any sort of conversation like this with anybody who's listening to us talk about the climate movement, and specifically youth activism and the climate movement. We just really non-violence, apolitical. We just want conversations started because we can't participate in the conversations, not yet. What we can do is we can start them. We can say, we got in contact with Cruz's people before and after the action. We are going to have meetings with his people because we want this, we want a climate plan. We can start those conversations. We can get those balls rolling. What happens after that isn't directly in our control, but that incitation, that's really what XR is all about.
Thank you. What I've really appreciated about XR, both overall internationally and XR Youth, I was speaking to your colleague Aidan Liss, and he talked about one of the core principles of XR is love and rage. And what I really admire about the ethos of love and rage is that, yes, it's disruptive, it is gaining attention, it is demanding action, but it's done in service of something profoundly better. And it also, and this will be a great transition over to Sanjay, XR does a particularly beautiful job of honoring anxiety and grief and trauma and loss and feeling those realities while also finding love and joy and connection and community. And that both of those elements are part of creating change. Sanjay, welcome back. It's good to see you. If you don't mind just really briefly giving us a recap of what you were sharing about your work. And then I'd love, building on a lot of what Sasha's saying, how would you describe the world that we're in, what we're experiencing now in a couple adjectives?
Sure. So I'm a futurist, and I got into the work trying to think about how the world is changing and what the implications would be for my son. I was a young dad. I was 23 when my son was born. I was really trying to understand as many of the pieces of the puzzle as I could to say, well, how do I talk to companies? How do I talk to not-for-profits? How do I talk to governments about these changes that are afoot? And can we do something to either prevent bad things from happening or increase the chances that good things can happen? And that's what I view the role of foresight or being a futurist to be, is to either prevent suffering, and climate change is really, the more we let it go, the more suffering there'll be. We know that. And we also know that the more things we do that are positive and in the direction that Sasha's mentioning, the more likely it is that there's more chances for good things to happen. And so anyway, so that was the background. In terms of the overall mood internationally, I think on the mental health side, we're seeing a lot of data that's coming out that relates to anxiety, not just about climate, but about the economy, food insecurity, rising prices of basic goods for a large portion of people who were already worst affected by the pandemic. And so I'd say there's that piece. And then the other piece is, I think there's sadness, that people are kind of looking forward and wondering what's going to happen, if their parents, what's going to happen to their children. And that it feels sad that more forward-looking, thoughtful decisions maybe weren't made in the past. And then I think there's anger as well, and anger maybe picking up on, again, what Sasha's mentioned, anger in many different groups of society, that we aren't moving forward together in some way, shape, or form that feels coherent and that isn't fragmented and doesn't seem to have some element of divisiveness involved in trying to disrupt other folks who are really just trying to get the basic needs met of being human. And so I think, that encapsulates it for me.
One of the things, Sanjay, that Sasha's underscoring is, on one hand, these dynamic tensions between grief and overwhelm and anxiety on one hand, and connection, community, hope, passion on the other, that series of dualities. And she also underscored the intersectionality and interconnection of so many of these issues. As a futurist, how do you help understand and navigate the dynamic tensions that we experience as human beings, the dualities, the connections of the grief and the hope on one hand, and starting to see the interconnection and interdependence of all things? How do you think about that, and how do you help guide organizations to help navigate and lead through it?
Well, I think actually organizations would have a great deal to learn from Sasha and the youth involved in Extinction Rebellion, and a lot of young people who are doing grassroots work. I think they almost need to be, to Sasha's point, I think they need to be in the room. I think they need to be in the room influencing thinking. I'm finding it quite interesting that a lot of executives and leaders that I meet inside of organizations, they feel disempowered within their organizations on issues like climate and how to address them. They almost sound as if they feel more disempowered than Sasha does, doing what she's doing. And I think it's almost as if they need to be reminded why they're doing what they're doing in their jobs. It's to do things that make the world better for not just Sasha, but every young person who needs to be taken care of by someone else, and everyone that's growing into their adult selves as well, going from being a youth to to going off to doing whatever's next, right? So I think we actually need them in the room to help with that guiding process, certainly to be a voice in the room that helps the adults organize themselves in some way that they feel that they have to do everything in their power, in their roles, to try to address climate as a core part of what they do. It doesn't matter what role they're in, but that there's some interconnected way to look at that. What I'm trying to do is help the leaders inside of those organizations realize that if they're in an organization, that is the unit of society that we've used to get big things done. The only reason you do work in an organization is because you're part of a bigger group that can all do things. And if you do them all together, you're going to get someplace. So we've got to get people inside of organizations and leaders inside of organizations realizing that they're actually the ones who can get stuff done to support the aspirations, the just aspirations of, again, all the Sashas who are out there. And I hope we can do that together. Really, I don't think, but I don't think we can do it if we leave the voices of racialized youth, indigenous youth, others who have thought deeply about these issues, and bring that intelligence and insight as part of the transformation process.
I think that's a beautiful segue in our remaining 6 minutes to, I think, our shared aspirations, Sanjay, that at least you and I have been talking about, around the idea of intergenerational design and the idea that we are stuck in a series of patterns and incentives that are ultimately putting us in deeper and deeper ruts as we face more increasing urgency of challenges, whether that be across climate or racial justice or economic inequality, even to the very premise of democracy in the world. And one of the invitations of intergenerational design is how might we unite the experience and the wisdom across generations to challenge assumptions, turn brave truths into opportunities for change. And so over to you, Sasha, with the spirit of intergenerational connection, conversation, intergenerational justice, I would ask, what would you like leaders over the age of 30 to know about you and your peers and your aspirations for the future? What would you like us to know and do?
Yeah, I think youth activists in general have this rap of being really active, really radical, and really sort of punchy. We have a lot of conviction, a lot of ambition. We have a lot of drive and passion, and that's communicable in every action that any youth organization does. And when we talk about the issues that we're passionate about, it's clear that we have the passion. What we don't have is the life experience. And there tends to be this disconnect of, instead of pooling that life experience and that conviction and youthful energy into sort of the same powerhouse, instead of using that to drive movement and power, we have these two contesting systems. We have these two contesting ideologies. We have this work within the system, use our experience, get somewhere within these things that we've grown up with, and within these things that we are surrounded by and have been surrounded by our whole lives and have worked within our whole lives. And then we haven't existed with these systems for very long. We haven't existed within them as adults really yet. So we don't know how they work sort of on a fundamental level as having experienced them. We can read any manual, we can read any sort of memo, and we can get that information, but it's not quite the same as having experienced it. So we have these two different things. And what we don't see enough, and what I really think that any leader over the age of 30, any leader in general, we need conversations that are open and respectful between and across age demographics. We can't have sort of the contest of what is more powerful, youth activism, which is really energetic and really powerful and really passionate, and leaders over 30 who have experience within the systems that we're trying to reform and generate, and that the action that stems from that. So I think that I would just like those leaders to know that I'm really open, and all of us are really open and really hopeful and really excited to have these conversations, and not just to have the conversations actually, but to be able to work together to open sort of the minds of leaders over 30 to having youth in the room, not maybe just making the decisions or signing off on them or saying, yes, this aligns with our values and principles, but being able to have a voice in those spaces, to raise points that maybe they didn't know were going to be raised, to be able to share this really valuable youth lens, this really valuable lens of little attachment to the past and just this drive and desperation for progression. Because that's the difference between youth and anybody who has an attachment or tether to the past. Anybody who exists and functions within the systems is, if we don't have the tether, we're generally more radical. And we need that radicalism. We also need the tether in the same space to be able to function and to be able to have tangible action and change.
Great. I really appreciate this combination of both sort of radical desire for change, passion, commitment, creativity, influence, and culture, but openness, generosity, humility, respect for all perspectives that can allow us to create connections and relationship across generation. Closing word to you, Sanjay, what would you like Sasha and her peers to know about your context, and what would be your invitation to intergenerational connection and creativity?
Well, I think one of the challenging things to say, it's a hard thing to say, is that we're all figuring it out and trying to find every avenue we can to reach into people's consciousness to help make some shifts occur. Part of the challenge is that you can only work with people who are willing to listen and truly listen and take what you're saying into their hearts in some way as part of the process of transformation. And I think part of what we have to do is also not just go after the companies that are doing the wrong thing, quite clearly from an environmental and climate and other sort of standpoints, but who are the people we can work with who do want to learn from the cohort of Sasha, right? And who do need to use all the research they've done, all the thinking they've done, all the implications they've looked at to make better organizations that are responsive to the reality of human needs in the world. Yes, every business to survive needs to make some money. That's we shouldn't be talking about that anymore. It's sort of absurd. But we really have to harness their knowledge, because in rooms I meet people who don't have the knowledge of not just Sasha, but the many young people I've met who've been involved in the climate movement. They're much more knowledgeable than senior people, like CEOs even, like board directors. Board directors don't have the climate knowledge that Sasha has, some of them anyway. I'd say a lot of them. So we really have to work together to find the people who want to listen and also want to use that as part of their planning process and strategic planning to feed that knowledge in and create even more momentum to do things that they didn't think they'd do, but that were pushed the boundaries and made what they do better. So that's sort of my invitation, for us to work together, Raphael, to find those organizations that want to work with us, and we bring the young people in.
Amen. So I want to thank you, Sasha, so much for your time and your commitment, your passion, your stories. The same for you, Sanjay. Thank you so much for joining us. I think as we return to the beginning of our conversation, and how might we navigate the space in between stories of what we've inherited and what we hope for, may we together, turn a moment that feels like a moment of intergenerational injustice to a moment of intergenerational understanding and healing and repair and care and creativity and influence. May that be our aspiration together. Sanjay, thank you. Sasha, thank you so much for your example, your inspiration. And now it is my delight to turn it over to Victoria, who is going to pick up the conversation in Hong Kong as we pass it from North America over to Hong Kong and continue our conversation there. So thank you all very much, and keep on rocking. Bye-bye, everyone.